Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first installment of the Future President podcast, a podcast where I like to talk about news, politics, and political discussion in the United States and around the world. Today, we're going to be talking about Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's victory in the recent Canadian election, as well as some pressures that President Trump has been facing legally and by the public. Let's get into it. All right, first order of business. It seems Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, recent Prime Minister, he's only been Prime Minister for a very, very short amount of time now, since Trudeau resigned, I believe March. I believe it was March. It may have been early April, but I'm quite sure it was March. And he has won 169 seats, while the Conservatives have won 144 seats. And it's also worth noting that for a majority of seats, a Canadian party needs to have 172. And since they have 169, it's unlikely that unless the Conservatives ally with every other coalition or make a coalition with everybody else, that they'll be able to make a vote of no confidence against Carney. So, but what does Carney's sort of election demonstrate? Well, it doesn't help that immediately before the election, Trump said, according to Politico, "Good luck to the great people of Canada," Trump said on Truth Social at 8:36 a.m. ET on Monday as polls in parts of the country were opening, landing on the morning of one of the most consequential elections in decades. It's also worth noting Trump went on to later describe how to go on with the sort of annexation jokes about Canada, talking about how artificial the Canadian border was, and that we should just remove it and annex Canada. And this does not seem to bode well with the Canadian public, as demonstrated by the Liberal Party's sort of ballooning in popularity as of recent, in sort of juxtaposition to the Conservative Party with Pierre Poilievre. And for Pierre Poilievre, while he made an effort, a very, very cognitive effort to disassociate himself with Trump and the Trump administration, it didn't seem that he was able to push it aside, because he himself, of course, is a conservative. He's on the right, and people assumed that he would be more friendly to America, perhaps a lapdog or a quisling for America, and so they just went with the opposite. So I think this just sort of reflects, of course, I don't know about the annexation threats, if that was what really pushed the tide. I think more so it was likely the tariffs, because the tariffs are the real things that are having like an actual physical economic impact rather than merely a rhetorical one. So these tariffs, and it's also particularly interesting because Canada's been in a point of stagnation in the past like decade and a half, as it relates to home ownership, general economic prosperity. There's even crime has gone up and everything. It's not been a particularly prosperous tenure of the Liberal Party in Canada, which is why they were originally losing to Pierre Poilievre in the polls. And that's because it's just the shift of the election in Canada completely went towards not immigration, not economic reform, not the fact that Canada indeed is actually controlled by an oligopoly in almost every major industry that's creating a lack of prosperity for the Canadians and the like, but just about Canadian nationalism and about avoiding Trump and being contrarian to Trump, because Trump is considered the major threat right now, and we can't, and all the other issues were just kind of much less importance, secondary to that sort of threat by Trump. So I mean, in that way, the election's kind of fascinating because you really have to understand that Canada is a country with wages lower than that of, say, the U.S. state of Michigan, but a cost of living higher than that of California. It's really quite disastrous for the Canadian people, and for them to elect an incumbent, someone who's been incumbent for 10 years and been aloof to these conditions effectively, seems really fascinating because of how the attention was just so easily directed to something else. But it just goes to show, I think, how this sort of American posturing by the Trump administration is affecting other countries, be it through tariffs, through threats of annexation, or half-witted jokes of annexation. It just sort of seems to reflect a greater anti-American undercurrent that's occurring in the developed world, where it was mostly aligned to America originally. And I think this even has some implications as it results to trading, the economic sort of web of the world. I think will be directed more towards China as a result of this. You can even see in Mark Carney's speech some of the anti-American rhetoric that he uses. And I think this is really all just exemplified by what Carney was saying in his post-election victory speech in Canada.
As I've been warning for months, America wants our land, our resources, our water, our country. Never. But these are not idle threats. President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never ever happen. But we also must recognize the reality that our world has fundamentally changed.
Yeah, so you can kind of see it right there, folks. The sort of shift in rhetoric of in Canada towards the sort of Canadian, I don't even want to say Canadian nationalism, but this sort of anti-Americanism movement in Canada, which naturally is to the benefit of America's competitors in terms of trading and in terms of diplomacy and stewardship. Also, away from the Canadian election, it seems there's going to be a 100-day celebration for the Trump administration in Macomb County, Michigan, just north of Detroit, I believe. And according to AP News, it seems that Trump is going to be discussing tariffs, as some of the signs suggest outside of the rally. And this just kind of and going back to Canada and Mark Carney and everything, this just kind of makes you wonder. What's really the big plan with the tariffs here? Because this isn't some sort of like Napoleonic blockade like they did in the very early 1800s. It's because the original objective, or the supposed objective, presumed objective, is that we're trying to box in China and we're trying to prevent China from becoming from gaining economic and diplomatic influence with countries around the world. But the election of Mark Carney proves that the Trump trade strategy is doing just the opposite. So it's not like, and going back to Napoleon, the Napoleon blockade of Britain in the early 1800s, it served the purpose of targeting a specific country. It strengthened its alliances with continental Europe, the places that the UK was trading with and giving money to and bribing and everything to go against Napoleon. It was more controlled. Of course, it failed because Russia broke the tariff agreement. But it's just to say that the Trump tariffs don't seem very directed or very concise in their goals, and it more just seems to be kind of a display of power and just trying to boss other countries around. For the sake of demonstrating American power and the influence that Americans have over the systems, over world economic systems. And it just doesn't seem very, and that doesn't seem to be a very good, it doesn't seem that it will have a very good long-term effect, of course, as demonstrated by Mark Carney's victory for other countries around the world, if he wants them to be just as friendly to the Trump administration. And you can kind of see this with the whole like the whole annexation threats of Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal with the Gulf of America, and it's just kind of alienating the rest of the world. So it may just be a power play of some sort of 4D chess move, but the tariffs don't seem to be particularly directed at the moment. But we'll see likely in a few months or years what the true plan was, or maybe not. All right, on a separate note from tariffs, it seems that a new lawsuit against DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and the government cuts of the Trump administration to government agencies is being challenged or brought forth. And according to NPR, a collective of labor unions, local governments, and nonprofits has waged a lawsuit against the Trump administration for exceeding its executive authority. So NPR says, quote, the complaint argues that Trump's February 11th executive order, quote, implementing the president's Department of Government Efficiency Workforce Optimization Initiative and actions taken since by his administration to implement it, quote, usurp Congress's authority under the Constitution. Now, this is sort of reminiscent of a previous lawsuit, actually just from a few weeks ago, where you had a district court judge, William Alsup, try to reverse the Trump order to terminate staff at 6 federal agencies in San Francisco. And the Supreme Court denied the district court judge Alsup's attempt to reinstate the jobs for these federal workers. So it seems that the lawsuits that's being undertaken right now will likely serve the same fate. This is just kind of as a result of the judiciary and congressional branch being sort of spearheaded by Republicans at the moment, who are more aloof to Trump's sort of unitary executive theory of government that he's engaging in right now. If you don't know, it's kind of the theory that that because the president is the only the president and vice president technically are the only elected officials of the executive branch, they are the only ones who should have power over it. And in the same article, NPR says, kind of exemplifies this with one of Trump's statements. Quote, he has repeatedly argued that the American people, through the 2024 election, gave him the mandate to eliminate waste, fraud, and inefficiency in the federal government. And this may be true, but it kind of it goes against a lot of norms within the current political establishment, where you have these independently operating agencies, so they can so you can have entities which protect, for instance, consumer safety, the environment, and be able to operate in a way that's sort of independent of politics. And of course, the most famous example of that would be the Federal Reserve, the Fed, with Jay Powell and all, with control of the economy. So it's difficult to kind of argue this on Trump's part, when you have especially those important agencies like the Fed, which would likely suffer detrimental consequences if they were to become partisan institutions. Which is particularly important to keep in mind because the Fed controls the dollar, and the dollar is the world reserve currency that many countries around the world use as a primary or secondary currency, and serves as serves as a sort of foreign policy influence on other countries around the world. So this sort of unitary executive theory taken to its extreme doesn't necessarily has a lot of problematic implications. And just as problematic for the lawsuit is the Department of Government Efficiency's influence on the federal government's decisions to cut spending for these agencies. However, I don't think that's necessarily a bigger problem, because it just kind of circles back, because DOGE, it's not an official government organization, but it's not as if it's making decisions independently. It's kind of like a suggestion organization to the Trump administration for what to cut and what not to. So it kind of just goes back within the president's authority, and then it comes back to the whole unitary executive argument. All right, on a not so different note, a recent Axios poll has come out, asking people whether or not President Trump is, quote, a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy. So here the polling shows all Americans, it says 52% of all Americans agree with that statement. And by party, it says 87% of Democrats agree with the statement, 56% of independents, 17% of Republicans, and by demographic, 67% of Black Americans believe in the statement, Latino Americans 63%, Asian American or Pacific Islander 58%, and white people 45%. So this obviously begs the question, is Trump a dictator? So I would say no, not necessarily because of the current American political institutions and ethos that we have. More specifically, so for example, in the famous sort of economics book, Why Nations Fail by Darren A. Smogel and James A. Robinson, it describes extractive and inclusive political systems founded upon whether or not a polity is subject to the constraints of power, to constraints of their power, and if power is distributed amongst common people as much as it is with the elite of a society. So in America right now, we still kind of live in an inclusive political landscape, because we have checks and balances, and we still elect our leaders. So it's hard to classify Trump as a dictator as a result of that, because he couldn't become a dictator if he wanted to. That said, though, there are some despotic and authoritarian aspects to his presidency, one could say. And that kind of comes back to the sort of the unitary executive theory that the administration seems to be preferring at the moment. And overall, the problematic use of executive authority, specifically in government agencies, and with the giving permission to DOGE to flush out these government agencies and reduce their budgets and the like. Also, just the sort of oligarchs that he's invited into his administration, the businesses and the billionaire connections and the like, such as Zuckerberg, Elon, the whole TikTok, not banning TikTok because it's benefiting him, sort of thing. And benefiting him in the sense that TikTok helped him win the election. However, again, it's worth mentioning that he's still holding to a democratic framework that kind of prevents him from becoming dictator, unless, of course, he were to prevent the democratic process somehow, which would go against the American ethos. But does he even want to be a dictator? And to that, it's a lot more complicated, because he may want to be something resembling a dictator, but it's more of a strongman figure he seems to be going for. He's not going for like Mussolini or Hitler kind of dictator, but something like more of a pseudo dictator, because it's clear that he has some narcissistic tendencies and he wants power and attention, but trying to become a dictator would probably threaten his current position of authority and ultimately his spotlight, because he would likely be ousted given the current democratic ethos in the United States. And whether or not he's trying to sort of ease the American public into a position where he can put himself in a place that would be considered dictatorial, like a frog in boiling water, or whether or not that's the case, it's hard to say, of course, because I can't read his mind. But it seems that he's trying to do something akin to that, where he's trying to slowly ease America into a position where the executive becomes more and more powerful. Whether or not to the detriment of the checks and balances of the American system, that's hard to say. But the judiciary and Congress are currently seem quite aloof to his practices. And I mean, that's really just to say that it is largely dependent on how his overreaches in executive authority are treated by the other branches of government. And of course, right now, as mentioned with the San Francisco district judge situation, where he overreached the executive authority and the Supreme Court denied the reinstatation of jobs, it doesn't seem that the checks and balances are working against him yet. However, at the moment, it's worth mentioning that a lot of this is sort of legally ambiguous. It's clear that Trump is extending his authority in the executive branch beyond comfortable precedent, such as, the deportation of people like Kilmar Albrega Garcia and the other individuals he's sending to the El Salvadorian prison, as well as, his overall approach to immigration and tariffs. And, well, I mean, I think the tariffs are less ambiguous, of course, but the federal agencies and the immigration policies more specifically, there is some legal ambiguity there, but in order for him to push harder on stuff, he'd have to be sort of certainly pushing against the sort of democratic, inclusive political institutions that America currently has, as described in Why Nations Fail. So I find it hard to believe that Trump is really going to become a sort of Hitlerian dictator. All right. Now, away from important political news, let's talk some pop culture, more specifically internet culture. So it seems there's been a bit of an AI video brain rot epidemic. So if you're not familiar, brain rot generally describes low quality social media memes or posts that seemingly degenerate the mind. And sadly, it's taken on a new form through AI video. So a good example of this would be the Apple dog AI videos. If you're unfamiliar, according to the website Know Your Meme, the Apple dog is, quote, a photograph of a dog with a red apple in its mouth, wearing a blue sweater and surrounded by other apples on the ground. This doesn't really explain it fully, I would say. The mouth, if you look at the picture, the mouth of the dog, of course, is notably gaping open because it has an apple in it, and the dog seems to have a kind of sad, distant expression in his eyes, I would say. But yeah, this jarring and ultimately memeable photo seems to have been transformed with the rise of AI videos. So basically, people are making AI-generated clips of this dog, getting into nonsensical and often physically impossible situations, like he's flying in the air or going underground, like no clipping through the ground. And these clips tend to range from about 4 to 8 seconds in length, it seems. And I think this is frankly a misuse and a disgrace to the creation of AI video. I say that jokingly, but seriously, AI video has reached a sort of revolutionary point in society, and it's interesting to see how that is taken on in a sort of cultural form. Because the AI video right now, it's in sort of a primitive state, obviously, and that's why you have AI videos that you'll see the dog flying in the air, going into the ground, and these in this sort of weird surrealist manner. So, I don't know. I find it interesting. There's also, of course, other types of this AI video brain rot. You have this thing called Italian brain rot, which is just these cartoonish, silly-looking figures, who, and also just ridiculous-looking figures. Like one of them is a shark with Nike shoes, and sometimes they'll have AI videos accompanied with them where they'll be fighting or exploding randomly, just spontaneously combusting. But yeah. Anyway, that should do it for this episode. Please leave a like or comment on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you stream this show. New episodes should be coming out Thursday with an exclusive interview this Sunday. I am your host, Aiden, and this is the Future President Podcast.